Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we're going to talk about what happens when the peshat, the plain meaning of the Chumash, and the derash, the rabbinic interpretation, and specifically when it has halachic consequences, conflict, when there is a gap between them or they conflict. The reason why I want to talk about this is because Piggul is just such an example. The rabbis explain Piggul as a situation in which somebody is giving a korban. In our case, because we're in Menachot, it's a korban mincha, but actually Piggul in the psukim stems from an animal korban. Someone's giving a korban, and in the process of giving that korban, they have kavana, they have intention to either do some of the avoda, to do some of the worship on the mizbeach, on the altar, or to eat the korban or parts of the korban after the allotted time. Either of those, after the allotted time, either doing the avoda on the mizbeach after the allotted time, or eating the korban after the allotted time, that is called Piggul. But when you look at the Torah itself, in the Torah itself, that doesn't actually appear as a thought that one has. It actually appears as a concrete actuality that a person indeed does eat the korban food after the allotted time. So what I want to understand is, how do traditional commentators deal with the difference between the peshat and the derash? And as we learn this, we will also learn quite a bit about Piggul. So there's actually two mishnayot that tipped me off to thinking about Piggul for this week's shiur. And those mishnayot both appear in this week's daf. One is on Yud Aleph Amud Bet, and the other one is on Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So I'm going to just share my screen for a moment, and let's take a look at them. They're kind of companion mishnayot. A mishnah towards the end of Parak Aleph of Menachot, which is on Yud Aleph Amud Bet, tells us Hakometz et mincha, and I'm ellipsizing just to do the example of Piggul. Hakometz et mincha, someone who takes, remember, the portion of the flour out for the korban mincha, le'echol shiareha lemachar, for the purpose of eating the leftovers, the rest of it, the next day, which is past its time. O kizayit mishiareh lemachar, or even a kizayit of it, an olive's worth of it, the next day, again after its time. Or lahaktir kumtza lemachar, or to do the part of the avoda that happens on the mizbeach, namely to burn that kometz, to burn that bit of flour the next day, which is after the time, o kizayit mikumtza lemachar, or an olive's worth of it, o laktir levonata lemachar. And this is interesting because the next Mishnah is going to have a disagreement about this suggestion. But another way you might do Piggul here is when you are taking that kometz, thinking that you are going to burn the livona, the frankincense that's supposed to come with it the next day. Any of those things, Piggul v'chayavin alav karet. That is Piggul, and you require, and you are liable to karet if you eat any of that korban. Ze'aklal, here's the rule. Kol hakometz v'hanotin b'kli v'hamahalech v'hamaktir. Any of the four parts of the avoda process for a korban mincha, namely the kmitza, placing it into a kli sharet, walking it over to the mizbeach, and burning it on the mizbeach. If you do any of those, le'echol davar shederko le'echol, with the intention to eat that which can be eaten from it, or ulahaktir davar shederko lahaktir, or to burn any of it that is supposed to be burned, chutz lizmano, after its time, that's Piggul v'chayavin alav karet. Right? That is Piggul. And if you eat any of it, even on time, by the way, if you eat any of it, you get karet. The next Mishnah that shows up at the beginning of Parak Bet actually has a machloket as to whether you can actually do Piggul if what you're thinking about is the frankincense particularly. So it's a machloket between Rabbi Yossi and Tanakama. We don't have to go through it, but notice the Piggul runs through both of them. Now, when you look in the Torah, Um, you have in Vayikra Perek Zayin, Psukim Yud Zayin to Yud Chet. V'hanotar mibsar hazevach bayom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. And here we're talking about an animal korban. What's left over of the meat of the korban shall be on the third day, what we call notar, right? Leftovers, is supposed to be burnt in fire. V'im ha'achol yachel mibisachar zebach shlamav bayom hashlishi. But if the person eats of it on the third day, and we're talking about a korban shlamim here, lo yeratzeh, okay, it will not be acceptable. Meaning it sounds like if you actually eat the korban after the time that it's supposed to be eating, namely on the third day in the case of a shlamim, then the korban retroactively didn't count, right? Hamakriv oto lo yechashev lo, right? It will not be counted. Lo yechashev will not be counted for the one who gave it. Piggul yihiyeh, that is Piggul, which the Brown Driver Briggs dictionary, which is a very important biblical dictionary, says it means a foul thing or refuse. It will be a foul thing. V'hanefesh ha'ochelet mimenu avonatisa. And anyone who eats from it, it's shall bear its iniquity, shall bear right the iniquity of doing so. Now in Vayikra Perek Yutet, you have what seems like a repeat of the same halacha. V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim la'Hashem l'rtzonchem tizbechu. When you give an offering to God, it should be in order for it to be accepted. Biyom zivchachem yeachel mimacharat, on the day of the giving of the korban and on the next day. V'hanotar ad yom hashlishi, that it should be eaten that day and the next day. V'hanotar ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref, and if it's left over to the third day, it should be burnt in fire. V'im ha'achol yachel b'yom hashlishi, but if it is eaten on the third day, piggul hu lo yiratzeh, it is refuse and it will not be accepted as a korban retroactively. Va'ochlav avono yisa, and the one who eats it will bear a sin, ki et kodesh Hashem chilel, because that person has made mundane something that is holy to God, v'nechverta hanefesh hahi mea mea, and that person is supposed to get curried. Now, in both of these places, it looks like what we're talking about is eating notar. It looks like we're talking about eating leftover korban meat on the third day, specifically regarding a shlamim. However, Chazal interpret back from Vayikra Zayin, lo yechashev lo, instead of lo yechashev lo being part of hamakrivoto lo yechashev lo, in the sense of one who gave it, it will not be counted for them as a korban. Chazal read it as, what we're worried about is that the makriv, the one who is offering, is going to have an improper machshava, an improper thought. And what is piggul? Not eating it on the third day, but thinking, intending to eat it on the third day when you're giving the korban in any parts of the 4 steps of the process of giving a korban, right? Now, that's a big change. So how do we account for the difference between these? And not only, by the way, it's not only about eating, it's also a machshava for planning to do part of the avoda that happens on the altar late, not in its time. And it's not only for a shlamim, it's for all animal korbanot. And it's not only for all animal korbanot, it's for menachot as well. Although, by the way, if you look up in the Rambam, not every korban mincha can actually have piggul apply to it. So what exactly is going on here? So the Rambam explains this as a case of, seems, oral tradition. The oral tradition is that the interpretation is different from the pasuk itself. Mipi Shmuah, says the Rambam in Hilchot Psulei Mukdashin, chapter Yud Gimel. Mipi Shmuah lamdu shezeh shenamar b'Torah, we learn from a tradition, an oral tradition, that which is written in the Torah, v'im ha'achol ya'achel mi b'sar zavach shlamav, and if it is eaten from the shlamim, eino medaber ela b'mechashev b'shat hakrava she'ochal mimenu b'shlishi. It's actually talking about someone who is intending to eat right? As they do the hakrava, as they give the korban, they're intending to eat on the third day. V'hu adin l'chol korban shechishev alav b'shat ma'asav, and this is the same halakha for any korban that a person thought about as they're doing the ma'asim of the korban. Sheyochal mimenu, they plan to eat from it la'achar zman hara'ui la'achilat oto korban, after the time that is appropriate to eat that korban. And likewise, likewise, if somebody intended to put something on the mizbeach that is supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach, but la'achar zman hara'ui lahaktara, but after the time that is allotted for being able to do so. Kach lamdu mipi hashmu'ah. This is what we learned from the oral tradition. Echad achilat adam ve'echad achilat hamizbeach, whether we're talking about a person eating or the mizbeach eating, so to speak. Im chishev alehan achar zmanam are akorban pigul. If a person had the attention to do these things after the allotted time, that is pigul. So says the Rambam, we are talking about an oral tradition. Now, this does not surprise, because the Rambam teaches us elsewhere that he believes that there are two kinds of halachot that you find in Chazal, in rabbinic literature. One type of halakha, which is halakha Moshe Sinai, an oral tradition going back to Moshe at Sinai, and the other type of halakha, which is learned from the Yud Gimel Midot, Torah Nidreshet Behen, the 13 principles that the Torah is, by which the Torah is interpreted. He says that only in cases where the 13 midot are used to extrapolate something from the Torah will you find a machloket among rabbis. On the other hand, if you're talking about Halakha Moshe Sinai, there will be unanimity because it's an oral tradition. And guess what? On the matter of Piggul, as the interpretation of the pasuk, there is unanimity. So it doesn't surprise that the Rambam says, I can explain to you the gap in the interpretation between the peshat, the plain meaning of the text, and the derash, the rabbinic interpretation of the text. Namely, the rabbis had Halakha Moshe Sinai to interpret this pasuk differently than it appears in its plain context. The Rashbam has a different take. The Rashbam says, Chachamim akruhu mipshuto. The rabbis uprooted it from its plain meaning. Upirshuhu b'mechashev lechol mizivcho biyom hashlishi ba'achat midalet avodot. And they explained it as somebody who is thinking or intending to eat from their korban during one of the 4 steps of the process of bringing the korban. Shechishev b'shrita, and remember we're talking about an animal here. A person thought about this while they were doing the slaughtering, o b'holachat dam, or walking the blood, o b'kabbalah, or accepting the blood, o bazrika, or sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach, right? So I don't know why he puts holacha before Kabbalah, but that's for another day. But the point is, Rashbam says, not Halakha Moshe Sinai, the Chachamim did it themselves. Now, this is very interesting. What do you mean the Chachamim did it themselves? Why would they do such a thing? Now, let's assume Chazal, because of the concept of lo tasur min hadavar asher yorucha, that you cannot turn aside from what literally in the Torah, what the shoftim are going to tell you, but used by Chazal to understand the authority of the rabbis to interpret a pasuk. So let's assume that they have this authority. But why'd they do it? Why'd they change it? Okay. So Shadal, Rav Shmuel David Lutzato, is from 19th century Italy. He actually explains the pshat of the pasuk, and then he says, Aval zo be'emet chomer gedola. But the pshat of the pasuk really is very strict. Shemi she'achal mi besar hazevach betoch hazman yisa avono ki'ilu achal pigul. Right? A person, well, actually, let's finish the sentence. Mipnei she'achar kein lo nisraf hanotar יהיה כמי שאכל ממנו ביום השלישי. So he says, I think that this is a great stringency because what it really means is that a person, even if they eat the korban during the right time when they're supposed to, but they didn't burn the korban on the third day. So now retroactively, you're going to tell me that somebody is going to get karet for that. Ve'al zeh tamar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer has this question: Achar shehu kasher yachzor v'yipasel. Are you going to tell me that something that was kosher for the first 2 days of eating, that only on the third day, retroactively, it turns out that you did something that warrants karet for you? Whoa, that is really machmir. That's really strict. And then he says, "Lefichach hutzrichu chachamim lotzia katuv mipshuto." That's why the rabbis had to have a different interpretation than the plain meaning of the text. Ulefaresh, and to explain she'ein hakorban nifsal ba'achilat yom shlishi. It's not that the korban becomes pasul on the third day because somebody ate from it, right? Going all the way back, that means that anybody who ate from it on day 1 or day 2 now has to get kared. Ela im kein bishat hakravato hayta kavanat ha'ba'alim le'ochlo b'shlishi. They say, no, the only way that this can be an issue is already ahead of time there's a problem. It's not that we're going to go back in time and now retroactively make any of the eating that you did of this eating that warrants karet. It's only if at the time of the hakrava, at the time of the sacrifice, the ba'alim are actually thinking to eat it on the third day. Ulekach darshu hamakrivoto lo yechashev lo, and that's why they interpret the clause, the one who sacrifices it, it shall not be thought to him, as actually azhara leba'alim, a warning to, or really like a don't do, to the owners of the animal, shelo yachshavu b'sha'at hakrava lechol mibsaro b'yom hashlishi, that they should not think at the time of the offering that they will eat of it on the third day. And then, v'hanefesh ha'ochelet mimenu, one who eats of it, right? Im kodem achila yad'a machshevet habalim, if before eating it was known uh, uh, the thought, the intention of the Baalim from the beginning, from the Shat HaKrava, then avonatisa. Then they have a uh, uh, then they have a sin, right? He's troubled by the idea that if you eat on the third day, then retroactively you're eating on the first and the second day warrants karet. Instead, says Chazal had to pull it back and say there must be something you do at the beginning. So we're not talking about something that's retroactively impacting your eating at the right time, right? And by the way, he then later in his Perush here, he calls it a takana shetiknu. He says this was a decree by the rabbis, and it was lafit tzorech hadorot, and it's for the good of the generations, for the need of the generations. He also says is a davar muskam b'li cholek. Everybody agreed to it, and so that shows you something more about it being legitimate, right? He's a little bit worried about the idea that Chazal would reinterpret. So he's trying to express to us, well, this was something they all agreed on, and it's a takana that they were making, meaning it's within their authority to do this, right? That's very different from the way that the Rambam explained things, but he's clearly going in the tradition of the Rashbam. Now, I want to offer two more very contemporary reads that I think are also trying to deal with the fact that there's a gap between the pshat and the derash. And I actually think Rabbi Eli Haddad's read is quite interesting because in some way, it's not that he says it's halakha l'Moshe Sinai on the one hand, like the Rambam, and it's not that he said, chachamim akru et psukim me'apshat, right? Not that the rabbis, uprooted But actually, he basically says it's a result of the rabbis reading Vayikra and and Tzav, and coming up as they read those two parshiot, they actually have an understanding of what those parshiot are saying, and that their understanding of what those two parshiot are saying actually leads them to interpret the pasuk and really the psukim ultimately in this way. And so he says as follows. Kevan sheba parshat vayikra avodat hadam mitzuya b'moked avodat korbanot. In the Parsha of Vayikra, right, very famously, Vayikra and Tzav are talking about the same korbanot, right, twice. But in Parshat Vayikra, what's in the center is the blood. And that's why when we learned Masechet Zvachim, right, we started with a conversation about what is the role of blood in korbanot, right? Yotzei sheberega siyum avodat adam hakorban hisiga tachlito v'nirtza. What really that teaches what the consequence of putting zrikat adam, and not just zrikat adam, but the placement of the dam on the mizbeach in the center is essentially what it implies to us is that once you have finished doing the avoda with the blood, the korban has achieved what it's meant to achieve, and it has been accepted. Benigud lakach, on the other hand, kevan sheba parshat Tzav, but when you look in parshat Tzav, achilat hakorban mitzuya b'moked avodat hakorbanot, right? Sit and compare the two parshiot for yourself, and you'll see it, right? In Tzav, the focus, the central core is actually eating the korban. And because eating the korban, or eating what's left of it, right, is at the center, rak la'achar shehakorban echal husga tachlito, right? Only once the korban is eaten, and I'm trying to figure out if it's husaga or husga. I don't remember my hufal, right? Its purpose has been achieved, meaning it's not once the blood has been put on the mizbeach, it's once it's been eaten, which is later, right? Parshiot Vayikra v'Tzav omdot efo b'stira zo lezo b'nogel avodat hakorbanot hamerkazit, right? What is the center of the avodah? Vayikra says it's the blood, and Tzav says it's the eating of the korban. Im avodat hadam hikav parshat hamayim shel korban hakovat kashruto, if it's the worship that's done with the blood, that's the watershed of it and determines the validity. Harigamim yera psul achar mikein hakorban nirtza ve'ala laba'alim. Then who cares if there's a psul afterwards? Like, for example, eating the notar on the third day. The korban has already achieved its tachlit. It's already achieved its goal by the time you did this rikat hadam, right? You can't have a psul that's going to come later and retroactively ruin it because it's already done. Me'idach gisa, but on the other hand, if eating the korban is actually the watershed, right? Meaning hakorban yuchshar rak la'achar achila kedin shel basar hazevach. The korban is only validated once it's been eaten, right? Then, by the way, I could understand why maybe if you ate on the third day, then the korban has not been accepted, right? Because the eating is the thing. And so he continues to explain why he thinks the Chachamim interpreted as they did. Chachamim hichriu lema'aseh she'avodat hadam hi ha'peula merkazit hakovat et kashrut hakorban. If you were noticing in Masechet Zvachim, you would have noticed that the rabbis decided practically, their decision, their halachic psak was, they felt that the avoda with the blood is actually the central aspect that determines the validity of the korban. L'chein, therefore, hayu chayavim leotzi mipshutam et hapsukim hakovim she'achilat basar hazevach b'yom hashlishi mevatelet et hakorban. Therefore, they couldn't understand Piggul literally the way it's written in the Torah, that it's only on the third day. It doesn't make any sense. If it was already kosher at the time of the Zrikat Adam, afterwards, just because you ate something on the third day, it's not going to retroactively uproot the korban if everything is determined by the blood. Imzot, at the same time, kidei latet makom gam lebchina shel parshat Tzav, in order to give room also to the dimension in Parshat Tzav of eating the korban, hem lo akru din ze lechalutin. They didn't completely uproot the law. Hem shilvu et bechinat ha'achila letoch bechinat avodat adam. What they did is they took the dimension, and you notice this is for anybody who's familiar with Rabbi Mordechai Breuer's shita of the bechinot, right? Finding different dimensions in different places when a story is retold or when a halakha is retold, right? What they did is they wove together the eating and the avoda with the blood. Upershu, and they explained shemidubar b'mi shemechashev b'shat bitzua avodot hadam le'echol et b'sar hazevach b'yom hashlishi. That what we're talking about is somebody who is, as they're carrying out the avoda with the blood, any of the avodot with the blood, they are thinking about intending to eat the basar on the third day. Perush zeh hovil harchavat din piggul lo rak liyom hashlishi, and that ultimately, once you change it to machshava, it's not only going to be about the third day. Ela lekol machshava le'echol besar korban chutz lizmano. It's going to be about eating the meat, and we're going to add with the mincha also of any korban after its time, not just the shlamim, which would be day 3. Shari ein medubar b'achilat basar ela b'machshava al achilato. We're not actually talking about eating meat. We're talking about thinking about its eating. So here we have 3 different approaches to this issue. One is we have a halakha l'Moshe Sinai, and that's what explains the gap between rabbinic interpretation, the derash, and the contextual meaning of the pasuk, the peshat. 2, Chazal have the ability to uproot the interpretation. It's a takana, it's litzorach hadorot, they all agree on it, right? It was a matter of consensus. 3, actually, their interpretation of Vayikra and Tzav forced them there, right? You are, as an interpreter, supposed to take into account all the different pieces of information that you have. And based on Parshat Vayikra, they had very deep information that the avoda with the dam was actually the essence, and the achilat basar was something of a nispach, something that comes afterwards. And therefore, they focused Piggul on the machshava during the avodot of the dam, and then it becomes something that doesn't only apply to a shlamim, it becomes something that applies to all animal korbanot, but not only animal korbanot, it also starts to apply to the mincha as well. There is one more interpretation that I put on here, Rav Amnon Bazak, who suggested that actually what we're talking about is they were worried that just as the Nevi'im told the people so many times, here you are, you give korbanot, but you don't even have good midot. You give korbanot, you don't even understand what they're supposed to be. You give korbanot, but you're murderers and you're corrupt and you do terrible things. Therefore, Chazal wanted to focus on machshava more than maaseh. Chazal wanted to focus on the thought, right? Wants to focus on the thought. And the truth is, for those of you, again, Menachot is very much parallel. There are a lot of parallels to Zvachim. For those who remember, in Masechet Zvachim, there was a real focus on machshava. And I actually put in a link if people want to go back to the first shiur that I gave in Masechet Zvachim, which was about the role of machshava through the concept of the Shema. The last thing you have on this page, if you want to take a look, is Dr. David Brodsky wrote a really great article about how within Chazal from the Tannaitic period to ultimately the Babylonian Amoraic period, you start to see more of a move into the focus on machshava, of thought in general. But in the Tannaitic period, thought has to come with action in order to constitute a legal act, or really a sinful act in the cases that he's talking about. But once you get to Chazal in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Talmud Bavli, you see that there are places where machshava on its own, and he's not talking about Piggul per se, machshava on its own is enough to be considered a sin. If you want to read more about that, definitely check out the excerpt below, and I've also linked the article for you. Always great learning with you. Have a wonderful week.